My stepmother called and said, "Your father signed the house over to me years ago. You have nothing." I just pulled out a document dated last week. The call came on a Thursday morning, which I remember specifically because I was standing at my kitchen counter eating a bowl of cereal that had gone soggy while I wasn't paying attention, and the mundaneness of that detail has stayed with me ever since. Soggy cereal. That's what my life looked like in the 30 seconds before Diane Mercer blew it apart. She didn't even say hello. Her voice came through the phone like something sharp wrapped in silk, confident in the way that people are confident when they believe they've already won. "Owen," she said, "I think we need to clear something up about the house." I set my spoon down. Something in her tone activated a cold, specific alertness in me, the kind that doesn't come from surprise, but from recognition. As if some part of me had been waiting for exactly this moment for years. "Your father signed that property over to me 7 years ago," she continued. "It's in a deed of gift, notarized, filed with the county. You have no legal claim to it whatsoever. Whatever you thought was going to happen after he passes, I need you to understand right now. You have nothing." I said nothing for a long moment, long enough that she started to fill the silence herself, which is what guilty people do. Then I walked to my home office, opened the top drawer of my filing cabinet, and looked at the document I'd picked up from my attorney's office exactly 6 days earlier, dated the previous week, signed by my father, witnessed, notarized, and legally binding. And I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. My father, Gerald Whitmore, had built that house with his own hands when he was 31 years old. Not metaphorically, literally. He and 2 of his friends had spent the better part of 14 months on a 2-acre lot in rural Clemson County, pouring concrete, framing walls, installing plumbing that he'd taught himself from library books and sheer stubbornness. The house was a 3-bedroom craftsman on a slight rise, with a wraparound porch that looked out over a meadow his family had owned for 3 generations. It was never a fancy house. The floors creaked in the same 3 spots for as long as I could remember. The kitchen hadn't been updated since the early 90s, and the master bathroom had a clawfoot tub that took 40 minutes to fill properly. But it was my father's house, in the way that some things belong to a person at a cellular level. He'd built it for my mother, Carolyn, who died when I was 11 years old from a cardiac event that no one had seen coming. After she was gone, it became the house where my father and I lived alone together for 6 years, eating bad takeout and watching baseball, and learning how to grieve without talking about it. I grew up in that house. It was the only place on earth that felt like a permanent fact about my life. My father met Diane Casper at a church function when I was 17. She was 44, recently divorced, with a talent for seeming warmer and more attentive than she actually was. I noticed it immediately in the way that teenagers sometimes notice things that adults have talked themselves out of seeing. She laughed at everything my father said with just slightly too much enthusiasm. She asked questions about his past that felt less like curiosity and more like research. When she looked at the house on her first visit, her eyes moved over it in a way that reminded me of someone doing an appraisal. I mentioned this to my father once, carefully, and he told me I was being unfair and that I needed to give her a chance. So I tried. I was not successful. They married when I was 19 and I was away at college, which meant I didn't have to watch the transition in real time. My father assured me it was fine. Diane assured me I was always welcome. "The house," she said warmly, "would always be my home." She said it with a smile that I had already learned not to trust. I want to be precise about who Diane Mercer was and is, because this story depends on understanding that she was not stupid. Foolish people try to steal things through brute force. Diane was surgical. She moved into my father's life the way water moves into a structure, finding every small crack, filling it, expanding it gradually until the whole thing shifted without anyone being able to point to the exact moment it happened. She positioned herself as indispensable. She managed his finances, claiming he found it stressful. She screened his calls, claiming she was protecting him from salespeople and distant relatives who only wanted money. She made herself the intermediary between my father and the rest of the world, including me. When I called, she'd often answer and tell me he was resting, or busy, or not feeling well. When I visited, she was always there, always present, always subtly redirecting conversations. My father was not a weak man, but he was lonely after my mother died. And loneliness creates vulnerabilities that even intelligent people don't always recognize in themselves. Diane recognized it immediately and built her entire strategy around it. I should say here that I am not someone who is naturally suspicious or adversarial. I'm 34 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I own a modest condo. I have a small circle of close friends. I go to the gym 4 times a week. And I spent most of my adult life believing that people were basically reasonable, and that conflict could usually be resolved through direct communication. My name is Owen Whitmore, and for the better part of a decade, and I told myself that the tension I felt around Diane was my problem, leftover grief and loyalty to my mother dressed up as rational concern. I told myself this even as the evidence accumulated, even as my father seemed to grow more isolated, even as holiday visits became awkward and abbreviated, even as Diane began referring to the Clemson County house as our property, in ways that made me feel like a guest in a place where my handprints were literally still on the walls from when I was 12 years old. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself this right up until the moment I couldn't anymore. The moment I couldn't anymore happened 18 months ago. My father called me himself, without Diane present, which was already unusual enough that I sat up straight and grabbed a pen. He sounded different. Not sick exactly, but careful. Oh, the way people sound when they're choosing every word. He told me he'd been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease 3 months earlier. The pause that followed was heavy enough to fill a room. 3 months. He'd known for 3 months and hadn't told me. I asked him why, and he said Diane had thought it was better to wait until they had a clearer picture of the prognosis. I wrote that down. Diane had thought it was better. My father's degenerative neurological diagnosis, and Diane had made the communication decisions around it. I asked him how he was feeling, and he said fine, manageable, that the progression was slow, and the medications were helping. Then he said something that I've replayed so many times since that it's worn grooves in my memory. He said, "Owen, I want you to know that no matter what happens, the house is yours. It always was. It always will be." I asked him what he meant by that. He hesitated. Then Diane's voice came from somewhere nearby, not on the phone, but in the room, and he said he had to go. He'd call me back. He didn't call back. I tried 4 times over the next 2 weeks. Diane answered every time and told me he was resting. I drove to Clemson County on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after that phone call, unannounced. I told no one I was coming. I parked 2 streets away and walked to the house, which I recognize sounds theatrical, but by that point, I had begun to understand that I was dealing with a situation that rewarded caution. My father was on the porch when I came around the corner. He looked thinner than I remembered. Again, there was a slight tremor in his right hand that he was trying to mask by keeping it pressed against his leg. When he saw me, his face did something complicated, relief and worry arriving simultaneously, neither one winning outright. We sat on the porch for 2 hours while Diane was supposedly running errands. In those 2 hours, my father told me more than he had in the previous 4 years combined. He told me that Diane had been managing all the household finances since they married and that he had, to his shame, largely stopped paying attention. He told me she had refinanced the property twice without his full understanding of what he was signing. He told me there had been a document. He couldn't remember the exact details that she'd presented to him about 7 years ago, something about estate planning and tax efficiency, that he'd signed without reading carefully because she'd assured him it was routine. He told me he'd asked her about it recently and she'd become defensive and told him he was confused, that his memory was unreliable because of the Parkinson's. His voice when he told me that was very quiet. He was 71 years old, and his wife was using his own diagnosis to gaslight him about his legal rights to his own property. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to put them flat on my thighs. I left that afternoon with a list of everything he could remember about documents he'd signed in the last decade, every financial institution that had been involved, every attorney whose name had come up. I also left with a photograph of my father on the porch, looking out at his meadow, on which I didn't take intentionally for evidence purposes, but which later became part of a larger documentation file. On the drive back to Charlotte, I called my friend Rosario Vance, who is an estate attorney in Mecklenburg County with 11 years of private practice. Rosario is exactly the kind of person you want on your side in a situation like this. Methodical, unflappable, and deeply fluent in the ways that financial abuse can be made to look like legitimate estate planning. I told her everything my father had told me. She listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her. When I finished, she said, "Owen, I want you to come into the office this week. Bring everything you have. And I need you to understand that what you're describing, if accurate, is elder financial abuse. That's not a civil matter. That's a crime." I stayed in the slow lane the entire rest of the drive home and thought about what it meant to file a criminal complaint against the woman my father called his wife. The next 3 months were the most methodically exhausting period of my life. Rosario referred me to her colleague, Harlan Osei, a property law specialist with 22 years of experience whose office was covered floor to ceiling in legal texts, and who had the specific energy of someone who had seen every variety of human deception and found it more interesting than upsetting. Harlan pulled the Clemson County property records going back to the original deed in my grandfather's name. What he found took 3 weeks to fully untangle. 7 years ago, Diane had presented my father with a family trust agreement, which she described as a standard estate planning tool that would protect the property from probate and minimize tax exposure. It was, in fact, a deed of gift that transferred sole ownership of the property to Diane Mercer Whitmore as an individual, with a clause that allowed my father to continue residing there during his lifetime. The document had been notarized by a woman named Gloria Tennyson, whose notary license had lapsed 8 months after the signing. The witness signatures were from two people who, when Harlan tracked them down, both stated they hadn't understood what they were witnessing and had been told it was a routine estate document. Harlan set down the file and looked at me across his desk. "This document," he said carefully, "has problems. Real. Significant. Legally challengeable problems, but it's been filed. It's in the record. Challenging it is possible, but it will take time and it will get messy." He paused. "However, there's a faster route, and it requires your father's cooperation." That conversation with Harlan Osei in his book-lined office changed the trajectory of everything that followed. The faster route he described was a revocation of the deed of gift, combined with a new transfer of the property, this time to a properly structured, irrevocable trust with me as the named beneficiary and my father as the lifetime beneficiary, giving him every right to live in the house for the remainder of his life while removing the property permanently from Diane's reach. For this to work, my father had to be legally competent to sign, meaning Diane couldn't claim he lacked capacity, and he had to do it without Diane's knowledge until it was filed. This was the part that required the kind of planning I'd never thought I'd be doing in my own family. I was essentially orchestrating a covert legal operation to extract my father's most valuable asset from the hands of a woman who had manipulated him for over a decade. I felt ill about it for exactly 2 days, and then I thought about my father pressing his trembling hand against his leg on that porch, telling me the house was mine, and I stopped feeling ill and started making phone calls. Getting my father alone was the first obstacle. Diane's management of his schedule and social contacts had become comprehensive enough that she monitored his phone, screened his visitors, and drove him to most of his medical appointments. But she could not be everywhere, and she had a weakness: a monthly book club that met on the second Wednesday of each month at a community center 40 minutes away. She never missed it. My father had mentioned this to me once as evidence that she had her own interests, her own life, as though her predictable absence one evening a month was proof of healthy independence. I noted it differently. I coordinated with my father's primary care physician, Dr. Ambrose Khatri, who had been treating him for 6 years and who had already documented concerns about potential isolation and undue influence in my father's file after a previous appointment where Diane had answered every question directed at my father before he could speak. Dr. Khatri couldn't share specifics with me due to patient privacy, but he could tell me, when I called as my father's son with documented concern about his welfare, that he would be happy to schedule a cognitive assessment appointment on a date and time that worked for my father, and that my father was welcome to arrange his own transportation. The appointment was scheduled for the second Wednesday of the following month. Harlan Osei arranged to be present in a professional capacity. My father arranged his own Uber. The cognitive assessment was conducted by Dr. Priya Sundaram, a geriatric neurologist at the Clemson County Medical Center with 18 years of clinical experience in Parkinson's disease and associated cognitive effects. I want to be very clear about what happened in that assessment, because Diane later claimed my father had been tricked and was not competent to sign legal documents. Dr. Sundaram spent 2.5 hours with my father. She administered the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, a trail-making test, verbal fluency evaluation, and a structured interview assessing his understanding of his own assets, legal rights, and the nature of the documents he would be signing. My father scored in the normal range on every metric. His Parkinson's diagnosis affected his motor function and had caused some minor processing speed reduction, but his memory, judgment, and legal capacity were fully intact. Dr. Sundaram documented this in a written assessment that was 6 pages long, signed and dated, and included the specific statement. This patient demonstrates full legal competency to make and understand decisions regarding his personal property and estate. His expressed wishes regarding said property appear to be voluntary and free from external pressures or undue influence. That assessment became what Harlan Osei later called, with characteristic understatement, somewhat useful. On a Wednesday evening in March, while Diane Mercer Whitmore was 40 minutes away, discussing whatever book her club had chosen that month, my father sat in Harlan Osei's traveling office, set up in the kitchen of the Clemson County house, where my father had made coffee from a machine he'd owned for 20 years, and signed 4 documents. The first was a formal revocation of the deed of gift that Diane had obtained 7 years earlier, citing fraud, misrepresentation, and the use of a lapsed notary, and providing a detailed account of the circumstances under which my father had been induced to sign the original document. The second was a transfer of the property into an irrevocable trust with my father named as lifetime beneficiary and me named as the remainder beneficiary and trustee. The third was a durable power of attorney naming me as my father's legal representative in all property matters. The fourth was a sworn affidavit written in my father's own words and reviewed by Harlan, describing the history of Diane's management of his finances, the circumstances of the original deed of gift, and her recent attempts to convince him that his memory of events was unreliable. 2 independent witnesses signed each document. A licensed, active notary named Bernard Achabe is with 14 years of practice and an immaculate license record, notarized every page. Harlan filed the paperwork with the county recorder's office the following morning at 9:02 a.m. The deed of gift to Diane Mercer Whitmore was legally revoked. The house was no longer hers. It had never really been. I didn't call Diane. I didn't tell her anything. I went back to Charlotte, went to work, and waited. I picked up the trust documents from Harlan's office on Thursday of the following week. I put them in a blue folder in my top drawer, and I ate dinner, and I watched television, and I slept reasonably well for the first time in months. 6 days after I picked up that folder, on a Thursday morning, while I was standing at my kitchen counter eating a bowl of cereal, and Diane Mercer called and told me that my father had signed the house over to her 7 years ago, and that I had nothing. I set my spoon down. I walked to my filing cabinet. I looked at the document dated the previous week. And then I said very calmly, "Diane, I think you should call your attorney. This afternoon, if possible. Tell them the deed of gift has been revoked." The silence on her end lasted long enough that I could hear her breathing change. "What?" she said. "What did you say?" I said, "Call your attorney. The revocation was filed last week. The property is now in a trust. You have no claim to it." She hung up. 40 minutes later, she called back screaming. What followed was 6 weeks of the most aggressive, irrational, and ultimately self-defeating legal maneuvering I have ever witnessed. Diane hired an attorney named a man I'll refer to only as her counsel, through a firm in Columbia that specialized in estate disputes. He sent a letter to Harlan within 3 days, claiming that the revocation was invalid because my father had lacked the cognitive capacity to sign legal documents. Harlan forwarded Dr. Sundaram's 6-page assessment by return mail the same afternoon, along with the Montreal Cognitive Assessment scores and the affidavit of legal competency. The reply from Diane's attorney took 9 days, during which I imagine a great deal of internal recalibration was happening on their end. When it came, it argued that my father had been unduly influenced by me, and that the revocation should be set aside on those grounds. Harlan responded by forwarding my father's sworn affidavit, in which my father described in precise and clear detail the undue influence that Diane had exerted on him for over a decade. Diane's attorney went quiet for 4 days after that. Then he filed a motion in Clemson County Circuit Court to challenge the revocation. This was when things shifted from adversarial correspondence to actual litigation, and it was also when a second parallel investigation began that Diane had not anticipated and could not control. The elder financial abuse referral came from Dr. Ambrose Kotry, who submitted a formal report to Adult Protective Services in Clemson County approximately 2 weeks after the revocation was filed. He cited his documented concerns about isolation, his observations about Diane answering questions directed at my father, and the new information about the deed of gift that he'd learned through the public record once it was challenged in court. The APS investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Constance Beaumont, a 12-year veteran of Adult Protective Services who had investigated over 300 cases of elder financial abuse during her career. She was professional, methodical, and entirely unmoved by Diane's insistence that this was a private family matter being weaponized by a vindictive stepson. Constance Beaumont visited my father at the house on 2 separate occasions without advance notice. She interviewed him alone, without Diane present, using standardized protocols designed to assess fear, coercion, and undue influence. In her formal report, filed with the County Department of Social Services, she wrote, "The subject demonstrates an understanding of his assets and their history that is inconsistent with either cognitive impairment or voluntary acquiescence to the property transfer in question. He expresses significant distress regarding his current living situation and makes specific, credible claims about financial management practices by his spouse that warrant further investigation." That report triggered a referral to the Clemson County Sheriff's Department. The detective assigned to the elder abuse investigation was Raymond Tilbrook, 17 years with the Clemson County Sheriff's Department, and 8 of those in the Financial Crimes and Elder Abuse Unit. I met him in person for the first time on a Friday afternoon in April at the county offices. It's in a room with fluorescent lighting and a table that had seen better decades. Detective Tilbrook was the kind of person who seemed to take up more space than his physical size would suggest. Unhurried, quietly attentive, writing things in a notebook with a pen that he kept clicking open and closed in a way that I found oddly calming. He walked me through the investigative process, explained what they were looking for and what would constitute actionable evidence under South Carolina statute, and made clear that this process would take time. Then he asked me if I had documentation. I put Harlan Osie's binder on the table. It was 2.5 inches thick. Detective Tilbrook flipped through the first 30 pages and then looked up at me with an expression that I can only describe as professional satisfaction. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "now you documented this very thoroughly." "I had good advice," I said. "Keep documenting," he said, and clicked his pen. The financial investigation that Detective Tilbrook's unit opened over the following weeks revealed a scope of behavior that, even given everything I already knew about Diane, was genuinely staggering. I want to walk through what they found, because the details matter, and because understanding them is the difference between seeing Diane as someone who made a questionable estate decision and seeing her for what she actually was. The bank records subpoenaed from the joint accounts she had managed showed a pattern of transfers that began within 14 months of her marriage to my father. Small amounts at first. 200 here. The 300 there moved into a personal account held solely in her name at a different institution. The amounts grew steadily over time. By the end of year 3 of the marriage, the transfers had become monthly and substantial. By year 7, roughly corresponding to the time she'd obtained the fraudulent deed of gift, there had been a single transfer of $62,000 from my father's investment account to her personal account, documented with a memo line that read "loan repayment," for which no corresponding loan could be found in any record. Over the course of 11 years, Detective Tilbrook's unit calculated that Diane had transferred approximately $340,000 from my father's accounts to herself. $340,000, my father's retirement savings, my mother's life insurance payout, which my father had never touched, money that had been sitting in accounts for over 2 decades, slowly drained while my father trusted his wife. And Diane assured him everything was handled. I learned about the scope of the financial investigation on a Monday morning when Detective Tilbrook called my cell phone. I had just arrived at my office and was hanging up my jacket when my phone rang. He told me what they'd found in measured, factual terms, the way people deliver information that they know is going to hit hard. I sat down in my desk chair and stayed there without moving for a while after we finished talking. $340,000. I kept trying to hold that number in my head and keep attaching it to the right images. My father eating takeout with me in the kitchen of that house. My father refinishing the porch railing by himself one summer because he said it needed doing. My father pressing his hand against his leg on that porch so I wouldn't see the tremor. $340,000. Gone. Quietly, systematically, over 11 years, by a woman he'd married in a church. My hands were flat on my desk, and I was staring at the wall calendar and thinking about nothing in particular, which is what happens when something is too large for regular thought. After a while, I got up and went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists the way my mother used to tell me to do when I was upset. But then I went back to my desk and sent Harlan Osie an email that said, "They found the financial transfers. All of them. Call me when you can." Diane's response to the financial investigation was to accelerate her legal challenge to the revocation, apparently on the theory that if she could establish ownership of the house before the criminal investigation concluded, she'd have a better negotiating position. Her attorney filed a motion for emergency injunctive relief, asking the court to freeze any transactions involving the property while the ownership dispute was adjudicated. This was, Harlan explained to me over the phone with barely concealed amusement, a significant tactical error. In order to obtain injunctive relief in South Carolina, the moving party must demonstrate both a likelihood of success on the merits and that irreparable harm will result without the injunction. Harlan filed our response within 48 hours. It included Dr. Sundaram's competency assessment, my father's sworn affidavit, Bernard Achebe's notarization records, the 2 independent witness statements, and a 20-page brief detailing the evidentiary basis for my father's revocation of the original deed of gift. He also included, with the court's permission, a summary of the ongoing elder financial abuse investigation and the preliminary findings of Detective Tilbrook's unit. The Honorable Circuit Court Judge Adara Nwosu, who had been on the bench for 14 years and who Harlan described as having a very low threshold for time wasting, denied the motion for emergency injunctive relief in a written ruling that was 3 paragraphs long and contained the phrase, "facially insufficient basis for the relief requested," in its second sentence. Diane's attorney apparently called his client after receiving the ruling. I know this because my father called me that evening and said quietly, that Diane had been in their bedroom making phone calls for 3 hours and hadn't come out for dinner. By this point, my father and I had developed a communication system that bypassed Diane's monitoring of his primary cell phone. He had a prepaid phone that I'd mailed to him 3 months earlier, an address to him at the post office box he'd maintained since before the marriage. We spoke on it every few days. These conversations were short and careful, but they were ours, unmediated, unmonitored, free of the interference that had defined our communication for a decade. I want to say something about those phone calls because they matter to me in a way that isn't strictly relevant to the legal narrative, but that I think belongs in any honest account of this story. My father is not an expressive man in the conventional sense. He didn't say, "I love you," without significant prompting, didn't easily volunteer emotional statements, communicated warmth through action and presence rather than words. But on those prepaid phone calls, in that narrow private space we'd carved out of a situation that had tried to eliminate any such space, he talked to me the way he'd talked when I was a kid, and we sat on the porch after my mother died and looked at the meadow together. He told me he was sorry he hadn't seen what Diane was doing sooner. He told me he was proud of how I'd handled things. He told me twice that he wished my mother could see the man I'd become. I took notes in a journal after every call, partly for documentation purposes and partly because I wanted to keep them somewhere permanent. The situation reached its peak on the morning of April 19th, which I will call the day the wheels came entirely off whatever vehicle Diane had been driving. It started at 6:48 in the morning with a call from my father on the prepaid phone, which was unusual because we normally spoke in the evenings. His voice was tight. He told me that Diane had, the night before, he presented him with a new document, a consent agreement in which he would confirm that the deed of gift had been a valid voluntary transfer and that the revocation had been signed under duress. She had told him that if he signed it, everything would go back to normal. She had told him that he was confused about the timeline of events. She had told him that signing was the right thing to do for their marriage. He hadn't signed. He'd taken the document to his room and called me at first light. I asked him to photograph every page and send it to me, which he did from the prepaid phone. I forwarded it to Harlan Osei within 2 minutes of receiving it. Then I forwarded it to Detective Tilbrook. Within 4 hours, Detective Tilbrook had obtained a warrant. Presenting a fraudulent document to a victim of elder financial abuse in an attempt to secure waiver of legal claims is, under South Carolina statute, a separate criminal offense. By noon that day, Diane was being interviewed at the Clemson County Sheriff's Department without her attorney present, because her attorney had not been notified in time to accompany her, and she'd apparently agreed to just talk without understanding the specific context of the questions being asked. People who believe they're winning are often more cooperative than they should be. I drove to Clemson County that afternoon. I didn't rush. I stopped for gas and a coffee and drove the speed limit the whole way, which took 2 hours and 40 minutes. When I arrived, I went directly to the house. Diane was not there. She was still, as I learned from a brief text from Detective Tilbrook, being interviewed, and would likely not be home until evening. My father was on the porch when I pulled up, in the same chair he'd been in when I'd surprised him 6 months earlier. He was holding a cup of coffee and looking at the meadow. The late afternoon light was doing something generous to the whole scene, turning the dry winter grass golden and making the tree line at the far edge of the property look like something from a painting. I sat in the chair next to him. We didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then he said, "Is it over?" I said, "Almost." He nodded. He put his hand on my arm for a moment. His right hand, the one with the tremor, and I could feel it vibrating slightly against my sleeve. And then he put it back in his lap, and we watched the meadow until the sun went down. Diane was charged with elder financial abuse under South Carolina Code 43-35-85, a felony under state law, 3 weeks after that interview. The formal charges filed by the Clemson County District Attorney's Office included financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud in the inducement, presenting a forged or fraudulent document in connection with a real property transfer, and obstruction of an Adult Protective Services investigation. The DA's office also coordinated with federal authorities regarding the fraudulent deed of gift and the lapsed notary, which introduced potential federal wire fraud exposure, given that some of the financial transfers had crossed state lines through online banking platforms. The scope of what they were looking at, $340,000 in unauthorized transfers, a fraudulent property deed, a failed attempt to obtain fraudulent consent from the victim under investigation, made the DA's office visibly interested in making an example of the case. I know this because the lead prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Felicity Okafor, 26 years of criminal prosecution experience, the last 9 in financial crimes, called Harlan Osei and told him with the measured enthusiasm of someone who has found exactly the case they've been looking for that they intended to pursue the charges fully and that they appreciated the quality of documentation my father and I had provided. The civil case, Diane's challenge to the property revocation, was essentially settled by the criminal charges. Her attorney filed a motion to withdraw from representation within a week of the formal criminal charging, citing irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy, which is attorney language for, "I've seen the evidence, and this is not a fight I can win." The replacement attorney she found took one look at the documentation Harlan had assembled and advised her to settle. The civil case was resolved through a consent order in which Diane acknowledged that the revocation of the deed of gift was valid, that she had no legal claim to the property, and that the irrevocable trust naming me as beneficiary was legally binding and uncontestable. She signed it on a Thursday afternoon at her attorney's office in Columbia. I was not present. Harlan called me after it was done and said, "We're in the tone of a man who has just finished a very satisfying meal. The property is yours, permanently and uncontestably." I thanked him. I thanked him genuinely and at some length, because what he had done for my father and me went beyond professional competence. It required a kind of sustained commitment to a messy, emotionally charged situation that not everyone would have maintained. He told me I was welcome and that the bill would arrive by Friday. I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. The criminal case against Diane moved through the system with what Felicity Okafor described as appropriate urgency given the victim's age and health circumstances. My father, at 71 and managing early-stage Parkinson's, he was a sympathetic figure in the most literal sense. A fact that required no calculation or strategy from our side, because it was simply true. He was also, as the criminal proceedings demonstrated, a credible and specific witness. When he gave his formal statement to investigators, recorded and documented in full, he described the circumstances of the original deed of gift with a precision and detail that made Diane's claim of voluntary transfer nearly impossible to sustain. He remembered the exact language she'd used. He remembered that she'd presented the document on a Sunday afternoon after lunch when he'd been drowsy, and she'd told him it was routine and that his attorney had reviewed it, which was false. He'd never had an independent attorney review any of the estate documents Diane had given him. And he remembered signing quickly because she'd assured him, and because he'd trusted her, and because that trust had been deliberately cultivated over more than a decade for exactly that moment. Listening to his statement on the recording that Harlan shared with me later was one of the harder experiences of this entire ordeal. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so precise and clear, and because in his careful, methodical recounting of exactly how he had been manipulated by someone he loved, you could hear the specific sound of a decent person processing something indecent. 3 months after the criminal charges were filed, Diane Mercer Whitmore entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of elder financial abuse and 1 count of fraud in the inducement. The plea agreement, negotiated between her attorney and the DA's office, included the following terms: 18 months of supervised house arrest, 5 years of probation, full restitution of the $340,000 in unauthorized transfers, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting her from any contact with my father, direct or indirect. The restraining order also prohibited her from being within 500 feet of the Clemson County property. She was, in addition, required to attend a financial accountability program and to submit to quarterly financial monitoring for the duration of her probation. She would not be going to federal prison, which some people thought was too lenient. Felicity Okafor explained the calculus to me plainly. The restitution was the priority given my father's age. And enforcing the payment was more reliably achieved through a supervised release arrangement than through incarceration, where it would have been effectively uncollectible. I agreed with this logic, though I won't pretend the part of me that had watched my father press his trembling hand against his leg on that porch wasn't hoping for something more. You do what the law allows. The law allowed this, and the restitution order was binding and enforceable. I chose to find satisfaction in what was rather than rage at what wasn't. Harlan Osei filed the final paperwork on the property trust on a Monday morning in June, and I drove to Clemson County that same afternoon. I arrived at the house in the early evening. My father had made dinner, which in his case meant he had ordered barbecue from a place in town that had been there for 30 years and that he loved with an uncomplicated fealty that I had always found endearing. We ate on the porch with plates balanced on our knees, looking at the meadow in the last light. The porch boards creaked in the same spots they always had. The kitchen, visible through the screen door, was the same kitchen it had always been. The old appliances, the counter my father had tiled himself in the early 90s, the window above the sink that looked out at the oak tree in the side yard. The clawfoot tub was still in the master bath, still taking 40 minutes to fill. Nothing in the house had changed, because the house had been the one fixed point in a situation where everything else was in constant motion. My father finished his dinner and set his plate aside and looked out at the meadow, which was lit gold green in the June evening, grasshoppers making their noise in the dry grass. He said, "Your mother would have been glad you held on to it." I said, "We both held on to it." He looked at me sideways and then back at the meadow and didn't say anything else, which was, for my father, a great deal. The full restitution of $340,000 arrived in a court-managed escrow account over the following 14 months, liquidated primarily from Diane's personal accounts, a retirement fund she'd maintained, and the equity she'd built in a condominium she'd purchased 9 years into the marriage with money that was now obviously traceable to its source. Every dollar was documented, every transfer verified, every disbursement approved by the court-appointed financial monitor. The money went into a trust account for my father's care. Medical expenses, in-home support as his Parkinson's progressed, whatever modifications to the house he needed to continue living there comfortably. It would not restore the years during which the money had been unavailable to him. It would not unwind the isolation and manipulation he'd endured. It would not give him back the decade of trust he'd extended in good faith and had returned to him as fraud. But it would keep him in his house, in his meadow, in the place his hands had built when he was 31 years old, and the future had seemed very long and very open. I decided that was not nothing. I decided it was, in fact, quite a lot. There is a thing that happens to people who've been through extended legal and personal conflict that I don't think is talked about enough, which is the exhaustion that comes after. Not the grief, not the anger, not even the relief. Just the deep physical and mental depletion that arrives when the crisis finally ends and your body realizes it can stop running. I felt it on the drive back to Charlotte after that first real dinner on the porch with my father. I felt it for weeks afterward. A heaviness that wasn't sadness exactly, more like the weight of a very long, sustained effort finally becoming fully visible now that it wasn't being deployed. I took a week off work. I slept 9 hours a night. I went to the gym and didn't think about anything except the physical mechanics of movement. I called my friend Rosario, whose initial advice had started this entire chain of events, and took her to dinner and told her the whole story from beginning to end. She listened all the way through, and when I finished, she said, with the directness that makes her an excellent attorney and a challenging friend, "You did the right thing, all of it. Don't let anyone make you feel complicated about that." I told her I wasn't feeling complicated about it. She looked at me carefully. "Good," she said, "because Diane made her choices. You made yours. Hers led here. Yours did too." That was more or less the last time I talked to anyone about Diane Mercer Whitmore, as though she were an ongoing subject in my life, which felt, after everything, like the most complete form of resolution available. My father still lives in the house. He has an aide who comes 3 mornings a week, a retired nurse named Dorothea, who is unflappable and practical, and who has a talent for getting my father to do his physical therapy exercises by pretending she needs him to demonstrate them for her. His Parkinson's is progressing as Parkinson's does, slowly and unevenly, with good weeks and difficult ones, with days where his hands are almost still, and days where the tremor is significant. He has learned to manage it with the same methodical, unremarked stubbornness with which he has managed every difficult thing in his life. I visit every 6 weeks or so. We eat on the porch when the weather allows. We watch baseball. He shows me things that need fixing around the house, and I fix some of them and hire professionals for the rest, and he tells me, each time without variation, that I'm overpaying the professionals. The property tax statements come addressed to the Whitmore Family Irrevocable Trust, Owen Whitmore, trustee, and my father keeps them in the same filing cabinet where he has always kept important papers, in the same kitchen where I once ate dinner as a child, and the floor creaked in the same spots it creaks now. The deed is mine. The trust is permanent. The house is exactly where it has always been, on the rise above the meadow, built by my father's hands, belonging to no one who doesn't deserve it. One more thing. About 6 months after the plea agreement was finalized, I received a single text message from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "You should know I never thought it would go this far. I thought you'd just accept it." I read it twice. And then I put my phone in my pocket and went back to whatever I'd been doing. There was nothing to say. She'd thought I'd accept it. She'd thought, like people who've been underestimating a specific person for a very long time always think, that the pattern would hold. That I would be what I'd always seemed to be in her accounting of me. Manageable, peripheral, the stepchild who'd grown up and moved away, and could be counted on to not make things difficult. She'd presented my father with a 5-day ultimatum dressed up as an estate document and waited for the world to arrange itself around her expectations. What she'd gotten instead was 18 months of careful preparation and a document dated last week. The house is still standing. So is my father. So am I. That's the whole story, or as much of it as belongs to me to tell.